Let's now talk about net neutrality and how that interfaces and intersects with internet censorship. Before we get into net neutrality, it helps to understand a little bit about the internet's business model. Here's a simplified version showing how internet service providers interact with one another. The internet is not a single network, but in fact a network of tens of thousands of independently operated networks that interconnect with one another. When those networks interconnect, sometimes money is exchanged between parties and sometimes it is not. There are two basic types of business relationships. One is a customer-provider relationship where one autonomous system or internet service provider pays another to obtain reachability to all or part of the destinations on the internet. There's another type of business relationship called settlement-free peering, which is essentially like bartering. Two ISPs or autonomous systems that interconnect may decide that it's mutually beneficial to do so, and so they might interconnect without necessarily paying one another because they derive some mutual benefit from interconnecting. This particular business relationship of settlement-free peering arises in the context of net neutrality, as we'll see in the coming parts of this module. The relationship of net neutrality and censorship dates to the Open Internet Order of 2015, which was in fact invalidated when ISPs were reclassified not as telecommunications providers, but as information service providers, akin to Google, Amazon, Netflix, or other types of service providers. But prior to the invalidation of this rule under the previous administration, ISPs were subject to a number of so-called bright line rules, where an internet service provider could not block or throttle any type of traffic, and also it could not accept money to prioritize traffic from certain other networks over other networks. Note that this is not the same as preventing all types of prioritization. It's always been perfectly in bounds for an ISP to prioritize, say, all video traffic over all bulk transfer. But where paid prioritization comes into play is that an ISP might not be allowed to prioritize FaceTime traffic over Skype traffic, or Netflix traffic over some other type of streaming video service. The rule also had various exceptions for so-called reasonable network management practices. The Open Internet Order of March 2015 reclassified ISPs as so-called Title II carriers or common carriers, essentially treating an internet service provider like a public utility. The upshot of this classification was that ISPs were prevented from performing any kind of any type of paid prioritization, throttling, or blocking, or any kind of discrimination of one type of traffic over another that could result in economic or competitive advantages to one sector over another. Note again that there are exceptions and carve-outs for so-called reasonable network management practices, and one needs to be clear about defining what those are. Interestingly, although ISPs were prevented from performing any kind of discrimination or anti-competitive behavior, the other parts of the ecosystem that didn't fall under the FCC's remit were not considered as part of this rulemaking process, thus making prioritization, discrimination, throttling, blocking, and other types of practices completely fair game in other parts of the internet ecosystem. And so while the Open Internet Order focused a microscope on the internet service providers, in fact, it left untouched large parts of the internet ecosystem where discriminatory practices with respect to traffic could or already were, in fact, taking place. This topic reached a fever pitch, even drawing the attention of John Oliver once the internet started to see congestion. It's important to understand the differences and the nuances between internet congestion and net neutrality. During the period of 2014, we began to observe extreme increases in network latency on various internet paths, particularly at peak hour times when users were streaming large amounts of streaming video traffic. The claim in the popular media was that internet service providers were blocking content providers as part of this. The claim that the cause for such latency spikes was that internet service providers were quote-unquote blocking content service providers. In fact, the story is quite a bit more complicated. Congestion, of course, can occur at various points along a path. They could occur at interconnections between internet service providers and their so-called transit providers, within a transit provider network, or even between the transit provider network and the content provider such as Netflix. It so happens that there was congestion at multiple points along the path, and certain tests such as the measurement lab tests appeared to exhibit congestion, but upon closer examination, the congestion that these tests revealed were not in the internet service provider at all, but in fact in a transit provider, Cogent. This was a prime example where an attempt to diagnose the problem resulted in pointing fingers at the wrong party. So was Comcast blocking Netflix? It turns out there are two sides to this story. And it boils down to what's often referred to as a classic peering dispute. On one hand, the content provider is asserting that by paying a transit provider such as Cogent, they've already paid for access to Comcast's consumers, the eyeballs that want to see that content, and that it's the responsibility of the access internet service provider and the transit providers to ensure that those links are provisioned well enough to avoid congestion. The access internet service provider, on the other hand, asserted that the content provider has enough traffic to congest any link that they please at any time, and the flexibility to choose transit providers. And so in some sense, it was incumbent on the content provider to balance their traffic across the available set of internet paths, since they, in fact, had control over the paths that were being used as the sender of traffic. Ultimately, this classic peering dispute was resolved in the open market, with Netflix as a content provider paying Comcast to augment capacity on the existing interconnects. In this sense, one could essentially argue that the market worked as it should. But it's important to draw important distinctions between so-called blocking, throttling, and paid prioritization, where there are direct connections with things like internet censorship and speech, to the cases where interconnecting networks on the internet have a so-called classic peering dispute or a dispute concerning economics. The two types of behaviors are in fact extremely distinct. And it's worth noting that these days, the access internet service providers like Comcast have a tremendous incentive to cooperate with the content providers and the cloud service providers like Netflix, Amazon, and Google, because so many of the ISP's customers depend on and rely on reliable access to those content providers. In other words, the internet service provider wouldn't have much of a business if their customers couldn't reach those sites. And so these disputes that we saw back in 2014 are largely dead now. For the time being, net neutrality regulation is also dead. Some provisions of net neutrality do pertain to internet censorship, such as those so-called bright line rules, but even in the absence of regulation, we've seen actually fairly good behavior by our internet service providers in the United States. And looking ahead, there is tremendous incentive for these internet service providers to cooperate with the content providers. And we may not actually see a need for increased regulation in the net neutrality space as it pertains to the prevention of blocking or throttling, simply because the incentives are now so well aligned. As we've discussed at many points in this class, the threats of blocking and restricted access are increasingly shifting away from the internet service providers and more towards consolidated content providers, such as large cloud hosting platforms, search engines, content providers, streaming video service providers, social media companies, and so forth, where there's an increasingly small number of companies that can make decisions that block access to significant amounts of content on the internet.